Welcome everyone to Start, Sit, Stash, Quit Week 7. My name is Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at theScore, and it was a very big week around the league. We had a few trades shaking things up, but now it's time to get those fantasy lineups set. So let's go over my favorite starts and sits for Week 7. Then I'm going to give you a couple players who I think you should preemptively be picking up. And this week, I got a couple of running backs who I think should be rostered everywhere, and they're both available in over 80% of leagues. Then, of course, we'll finish things off with two players that I say it's time to give up on. Let's send them back to the waiver wire in favor of some higher upside options. So let's begin with the starts. And at quarterback, Baker Mayfield versus the Ravens. This is the rare time where we have a quarterback who's playing very well, and he's squaring off with a defense that is struggling to stop the pass. Mayfield just seems so comfortable in that Bucs offense. He's the second highest scoring fantasy quarterback this year behind only Lamar Jackson. He's got great weapons around him. He's also adding a little bit with his legs this year, 136 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground through 6 weeks. And now he's facing the Ravens, who are allowing the second most fantasy points to passers. Mayfield, a top 7 fantasy quarterback in my Week 7 rankings. For running back, Tony Pollard at Buffalo. And we've highlighted Pollard on this show before, because before the season, the Titans coaching staff, they suggested that this was going to be a hot hand backfield, but it hasn't really worked out that way at all. It has been mostly Pollard leading the way. Now we have his backup Tajay Spears week to week with a hamstring injury. So Pollard's going to have even more chance to distance himself, and he's earned it. Pollard's gone over 85 scrimmage yards in 4 of his 5 games this year. He's got multiple receptions in every outing, and he's found the end zone 3 times. That's combined to make him the RB19 on a per game basis. And his opponent this week, the Bills, they're the second easiest matchup for fantasy running backs. They just gave up 169 yards from scrimmage to Breece Hall Monday night. So no Spears, friendly matchup. Pollard an RB1 this week. At receiver, Zay Flowers at the Bucs. Flowers, been one of the most boom or bust fantasy wideouts in 2024. He's got 3 games over 90 yards, got 3 games under 40 yards, but he's coming off back-to-back 100-yard efforts over the Bengals and the Commanders. Now he gets that pass funnel Bucs defense. They're giving up the 7th most fantasy points to receivers. We also have a very high projected point total on this game at 49.5. So that's why I'm really recommending to get as many of these guys in your lineup. We got Mayfield on one side. We got Flowers on the other. Flowers an upside wide receiver 2 this week. Then at tight end, Kyle Pitts versus Seattle. And yes, we're doing this. We are going back to Kyle Pitts. He put up a 0 in week 4. I know he only had 3 targets in that game, but since then, the Falcons have really made an effort to get him more involved. 13 targets over his last 2 contests. That's resulted in stat lines of 7 for 88 and 3 for 70. Now he's at home. He's in the dome. He's against the Seahawks, who are the 5th softest defense against fantasy tight ends. I think he's a solid top 10 tight end option this week. Now we can shift over to the sits next. And for my sit at quarterback, Kyler Murray versus the Chargers. He's the QB 12 on the season. Really has only gotten there because of 2 big performances. He's got a pair of top 5 weekly finishes, but then outside of that, he's been the QB 15 or worse every single other week. Now for week 7, things are kind of mounting up against him. His number 1 receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr., he's in the concussion protocol, so he's expected to miss normally 1 game when guys are in the protocol. I'm not thinking that he's going to play this week. And Murray's got to take on the Chargers, who are the 7th worst matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. So I'm projecting that this is not going to be one of these spiked weeks for Murray. He's more of a quarterback 2 in that one. For my sit at running back, Najee Harris versus the Jets. And Najee, coming off his first 100-yard game of the season, he found the end zone in that one too. So it ended up being his best fantasy performance through the first 6 weeks. But there is a big difference between the Raiders defense and the Jets defense. New York allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to ball carriers. And it doesn't help that the Steelers are dealing with injuries on their offensive line too, including center Zach Frazier, probably not going to play this week. We also have Jaylen Warren back in the mix. His usage could grow as he gets healthier. And the Jets Steelers, one of the lowest projected point totals on the week at 38.5. So Harris, really just a risky RB3 for that Sunday night game. At receiver, we're sitting Michael Pittman Jr. versus the Dolphins. I know he overcame the injury last week. Somehow he miraculously played, but this is something that he's going to continue to battle through. And even before the injury, Pittman only topped 40 receiving yards in 1 of his first 6 games this year, and he wasn't able to do it in any of the games that Anthony Richardson started. He also didn't find the end zone in any of the games that Richardson started, and it's likely going to be Richardson getting the nod over Joe Flacco this week. And when you combine that with the Dolphins being the 3rd hardest matchup for fantasy receivers, I just see Pittman as a wide receiver for flex who basically needs that touchdown to be usable in fantasy. And then my sit at tight end, Dalton Kincaid versus the Titans, another guy who's just been a bit of a fantasy disappointment this year. Just one game over 50 yards, just one touchdown on the season. Now he's got Amari Cooper showing up. He's going to eat into that target share for Kincaid. He's also dealing with a collarbone issue that had him limited in practice early in the week, so we'll have to pay attention to that and monitor that one. And he's got to contend with the Titans this week. They're allowing the fewest fantasy points to tight end this year. So Kincaid, more of a low-end tight end one with Cooper joining and with this bad matchup versus Tennessee. Now, we don't want to say anything else about my favorite team. We don't want to talk negative about their players. So let's move on. Let's flip the switch to something more positive and talk about the stashes. And I normally try to hit on guys who are under 10% rostered, but really, I didn't see much in that range this week. So we're raising the cutoff a bit. We're going to include some running backs that I just can't believe are available in most leagues. The first is Kamani Vidal on the Chargers. He's 13% rostered. And if you've been watching the show, you know, back in week 1, I mentioned him as a stash then. I also mentioned Tyron Tracy Jr. as a stash that week. That one definitely working out so far. But the thought process on Vidal, it's always been the same and it hasn't changed, right? The Chargers want to run the ball with that new coaching staff. They have that big offensive line. And the two veterans that were ahead of him, they had durability issues. Gus Edwards, he really looked like one of the worst backs in the league in the first month. He eventually landed on IR. Now the only thing standing in Vidal's way is J.K. Dobbins, who's kind of playing on borrowed time, right? He suffered that Achilles injury last year. He's always had durability concerns. I hope Dobbins makes it through the year healthy, but I have my doubts. And last week, Vidal got promoted into that number 2 role with Edwards out, and he made some noise, 51 yards and a touchdown. Now, most of it came on that deep pass down the sidelines, but we're still going to take it. A great sign that when he was given the opportunity, he was able to do something with it. So don't let him sit out there on the waiver wire. Scoop him up immediately. The same goes for Blake Corum on the Rams. He's 16% rostered, but these types of backs with these high ceilings, they should be rostered everywhere, because if a guy like Dobbins, or in Corum's case, Kyron Williams, if they get hurt, then boom, you got a top 20 fantasy back, maybe even better, that you can slot into your lineup. And Corum finally getting some work last week, turned 6 touches into 33 yards. And think back, he's a day 2 pick. He's a guy that has the chops to be a strong RB in the NFL. And Kyron Williams has dealt with injuries before, so it's not out of the question that could happen again. Corum would almost be like a 1-for-1 replacement if Kyron went down. So the fact that he's still out there in 84% of leagues, that is just mind-blowing to me. Get him on your bench ASAP. And if you need to free up some space to get these guys, which you probably do, I got a couple guys I think you could drop here. So for quits this week, you could consider letting go Jerome Ford on the Browns. He's 64% rostered. He was the Browns' lead back so far this season, but he really didn't do that much with the role. Only found the end zone once. Plus, a couple things have kind of changed this week for him. The first is that he's dealing with a hamstring injury, and they're calling him week to week. So I don't think he's going to play this week. We're not sure when he's going to be back and healthy. And that coincides with Nick Chubb making his season debut. So when we see Ford back, he will probably be in that change of pace role behind Chubb. But even with Chubb out and missing time, Ford wasn't that great of a fantasy option as the starter. So I think you can let him go. I would also cut bait on Pat Freiermuth, who's 74% rostered, and he's just not really playing a big role in the Steelers' offense fantasy-wise. 5 targets or less in 5 of his 6 games, under 40 yards in 5 of his 6 games, and under 30 yards each of the past 2 weeks. Freiermuth, he's not really even a good streaming option at this point, so don't hang on to him. Instead, go use that spot on somebody that could potentially make a difference in your fantasy season, even if it is somebody that's more of a long-term stash. But that is all for Start, Sit, Stash, Quit this week. If you want more, you can find all my content over at theScore. Make sure you're listening to theScore Fantasy Football Podcast as well. And subscribe to theScore's No Timeouts YouTube channel so you're getting all our football videos every week.